pod smashes of the internet, and welcome to another episode of
80-bit pod smash,
where gaming goes to grab a beer. We are your hosts.
Penguin and Termite. I'm Penguin.
I am Termite, and we are a weekly video game podcast smashing together ideas that you care about with video games.
That's right, and tonight we are talking about Marvel. We've done an episode on superhero video games before, but that was sort of general. That was any superhero video game, everything from Marvel to DC to like Infamous and games that are superhero games that are unattached in any way to like a major comic book company. So we're zooming in tonight on one of those comic book companies to specifically talk about Marvel and their approach to publishing and creating games and how that approach differs from how they handle their comics and their movies. It's very interesting. I think we should probably, in researching and thinking about this episode, I think I would like to contrast it sometime to doing one about DC, because DC's approach is a lot different, and I will withhold judgment until later as we talk about DC's approach. But those two being the kind of titans of superheroes and comic book media, it would be interesting to kind of compare and contrast the two as they exist in video games. So this is a video game episode. We're not just talking Marvel, but obviously we'll be talking about comics and the movies as well. So if you love Marvel and love video games, this is an episode for you. If you hate Marvel, then this is probably still an episode for you, because we're not going to be 100% just like showering it with praise. We're going to have some criticism today. Mm-hmm. So I think that it will be a show for everyone. The only people that don't care about the show, I guess, are the people who are literally apathetic and don't give a crap about Marvel whatsoever. So, right. Whatever. And then maybe still listen, because we're still talking about video games. So, all right, great. Well, with all that aside, we will get to that and more, but we are where gaming goes to grab a beer. So what are you drinking today? Today? Whatever.
Drinking another Sam Adams Oktoberfest.
Huzzah! You're like Termite. You're like Penguin these days.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's just in my fridge, and it's there. I haven't even made a chance to get more beer from anywhere else. I haven't really been around any breweries or any events that had different types of beer to grab, like I had been
almost
before.
Like you're in the process of making a huge life change or something. I don't know.
How about that? We haven't moved yet, but it's coming.
Well, it's still busy, I imagine. You're still preparing your house, and you've sold it though, right? Like that's the thing. That's under contract,
yes.
Right? Okay, I think my wife is stalking you on Zillow or something, and and said that you guys were under contract. So that's great. Yeah. That's exciting. Do you happen to know anything about the family that's?
Apparently, they moving up from South Carolina. That's all I know.
Interesting. Okay.
Yep. He started a job here, and that's all I know.
Almost sounds like one of my coworkers, but he would have said if he was moving. It would have been really funny if one of my coworkers.
Well, I'm not going to dox them, so I'm not going to say their name.
That's fair. I'm just simply saying I probably would have found out if one of my coworkers, one of my remote coworkers who lives and works in South Carolina, was moving here. He probably would have told me whether or not he was the same person buying your house. So please don't dox anyone on our podcast.
Nope. Yeah, don't do that.
I am drinking a Oktoberfest as well, but not Sam Adams. I am drinking Blue Mountain 5 Oktoberfest lager, and it's delicious. This is really good. I don't know. I can't say it's my favorite Oktoberfest, but it's a solid Oktoberfest. And
Which one's your favorite?
I don't know yet. I like Oktoberfest. We had your discussion a while ago. I think I kind of brushed you off, and I didn't mean to completely brush you off. But you had mentioned that you and other people were surprised how much they like Oktoberfests, to the point where they're like your second favorite style of beer. I think I only criticized you because you used the word everybody. It's everybody's second favorite, and I was like, it's literally not mine.
In the group of people that I was talking to.
Oh, see, that makes more sense now in hindsight.
Why would you think otherwise? Context was laid out very clearly.
Sometimes you and I are prone to exaggeration in the extremes. Let me put it that way.
Only the dark side deals in extremes.
And I'm all about that dark side. So I don't know what my favorite is yet. I'm still kind of like feeling out the differences within that, genre of beer, so to speak. Because they're really not all that different from one another. You put you drink two IPAs after one another, and they're going to probably taste different. You drink two stouts after another, they're probably going to taste different. But Oktoberfest, I feel like, are one of those like things that everyone just nails the same.
Right.
But that's not to say they're samey. It's just, I don't know.
They are samey though. It's a narrow style. It is a genre or a style of beer with a specific set of ingredients that you can't really deviate too much within it. It's very narrow.
Right. If someone was like, here's a blueberry Oktoberfest, you just say that's not an Oktoberfest.
Right. Exactly.
So,
So it's because of like what Oktoberfest is that makes it so constrained. So,
Right.
of course, yeah. There's just fewer variations between different breweries. So
I think
really
what
comes
stands
down
out to
like,
Blue Mountains, it's a little bit more bitter than I'm used to with an Oktoberfest, which is not a criticism at all. It is just something different, and therefore it stands out. I'm going to read its thing though, just because it's got a nice little thing. It's got a nice little, and I'm German, so I love me some German. Any reference to German culture here. But got your lederhosen in a bunch over missing the big fest in Munich. Don't worry, our authentic Weissbier is perfectly balanced malts and hops. Will bring the party to you. Prost! So, yeah, it's good. I like it. You should check it out, y'all. Well, that is what we're drinking. So, is there anything you wanted to discuss?
I do. Actually, I want to know if you would be willing to listen to a quick review of Metroid Dread.
Sure, go for it. Hit me up.
Because I've been sitting on thoughts about it, and
obviously
I'm a huge Metroid fan, and I've played all of them. I haven't.
Yeah, so we did a Metroid episode 2 episodes ago, I think, at this point. So if you guys want to hear more of our thoughts in general on Metroid, you can listen to that. It's called Everything Metroid, and I believe it was like 2 episodes ago. So
yeah, it was before Metroid Dread had come out, so we were super hyped about it.
We had recorded it before Metroid Dread came out,
right?
But the actual episode aired afterwards, which was my fault. So, but anyways, but yeah, no, I do want to hear your thoughts now that it's come out, and we did talk a lot about Metroid, so I know it's on both of our minds. So
yeah, so right now on the internet, the hype around it is all about the difficulty, which we can talk about in a moment. But it is a difficult game; it's hard. It is in the same vein of all the side-scrolling Metroids. It has the same formula you're love and well used to with the whole Metroidvania genre that it kind of is. So you have progression. It is kind of linear at first. You're locked down with your upgrades, and you get upgrades that open up the world, and you go through. What I love about this one in particular, and I will not wax too eloquently or for far too long, but it's perfect. It is the perfect Metroid game. For anyone who's at all interested in any of the side scrollers, I have played all of them. I have beaten most of them, and this is by far, they've nailed the formula. They've got it down. I still don't know if it's my single favorite Metroid of all time, because Super Metroid is just so awesome, and it holds a place in my heart that I don't think anything could ever kick it out of.
Right. And part of it's the time it came out, right? Like it was...
You mean
at its
Super
time,
Metroid?
There was nothing like...
So
at the time it came out, it was just kind of... There was nothing else like it, and nothing had copied it, and for what games were capable of at the time, it will always just sort of be that sort of revolutionary game for you. So I totally get that. A 2D side-scroller, by today's standards, could never compete based on just the context of when it came out. So I think... I'll answer that for you and just say, it's not your favorite.
Well, I can make an argument that Dread could be my favorite, and I'm about to do that. So what I love about Dread, if you played Metroid before, again, it has the same formula where you unlock stuff, and it usually requires some sort of backtracking. What is obtuse in the previous entries in the series is it's not very clear exactly where you should go. There's no hand-holding. Well, Metroid Dread also has no hand-holding either, but the level design is what has been perfected, so that when you do get an upgrade, you also get a teleporter that takes you to a previous area that just happens to be lined up and convenient for you to know kind of where to go intuitively. So while there's no waypoints on your map, there's definitely no hand-holding. You do need to backtrack. It helps you along. And what that does for you does not decrease the difficulty at all, but it does help continue the pacing. And as you continue to progress, you're always feeling like you're getting somewhere to the next thing. And it's just like the actual upgrades are the beats of the dopiate, what is it?
Dopamine.
The dopamine hits that you get. As you get a new upgrade, you're like, ooh, I can unlock all these new spaces, these new areas, or I got this new weapon that's really fun to try. And they're spaced out perfectly so that you just want to keep playing. It's like, I was so addicted to Metroid Dread, I destroyed it. I 100%ed the entire game in less than a week.
10 hours, right?
Short.
Took you about 10 hours.
It took me 10 hours to 100% a normal difficulty run.
And no trophies. Wow, Termite. Man.
My October PSN profiles trophy count is painfully aware of my deviation to Nintendo for the month.
If Nintendo released some kind of achievement or trophy system, would you... I know we've discussed this before, but I'm wondering if the answer has changed at all. Would you invest as heavily in it? Like, would you... I guess, not saying that you would... I doubt it would ever replace trophies for you, but would you ever feel fine, not getting a trophy this month because I got this Nintendo or whatever?
Well, because I am Termite, and it's probably going to infuriate you, I hold Nintendo as closest to my heart for gaming in general. Like, I am a fan of Nintendo more than anything else, and before PlayStation in my life. So I might switch gears to a Nintendo achievement system so hard that I would prioritize it over Sony.
Over Sony, interesting.
Because
okay.
I did the exact
that
same thing.
That doesn't bother me. That's
well, yeah, I guess not. I did the exact same thing because Microsoft had come out with the achievement system on the 360 first, so there was no competition. And then I got a PlayStation 3, and I still like held to the PS or to the Xbox 360 for a while. But when I got a PlayStation 4 and started like diving into that, I realized I'm a much bigger PlayStation fan than I have ever been of Microsoft. So what am I doing with these achievements? Screw that. I'm going for trophies. And so because of the two, I hold myself more of a Sony fan than I am an Xbox fan. And so I go after the PlayStation trophy system more
than anything.
And then
you're
the
a
Platinums
Nintendo
just
fan.
help, and the level profile like is more of the cool things around the trophy system that the Xbox never did. So those are more fun and more appealing to me. So if Nintendo were to come out with something, I would be like, I have to go back and play everything that has whatever Nintendo achievements are, because I love Nintendo more than Sony and Microsoft.
Nintendo, that's just one thing that like that's an example of a thing that like it's crazy to me that Nintendo hasn't done that, right? And it's one of those weird Nintendo decisions. I love Nintendo's games, and like you said, it always will hold a special place in my heart. But so many of Nintendo's business decisions just baffle me. I mean, we haven't even gotten into, not to completely pivot away from Metroid if you had further thoughts, but
I do have further thoughts, but you can finish this one.
I will finish this one, and I won't deviate. I won't like take us down this rabbit hole, but for us right now, when we're recording this, they just announced the whole like Nintendo expansion online pricing, and it's like obscene. It's not obscene in and of itself, but it's obscene in comparison to what it was, and the fact that they're now basically like they just ramped up the cost, and it's one of those things where
more
it's
than doubled.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of the things where it's like, Nintendo, what the F? So I don't have a lot of respect for Nintendo as a business. I have a lot of respect for Nintendo as an artistic video game development company. That's kind of where I have a weird dichotomy of emotions with them. So anyways, it's still good that I can separate the two. But so anyways, that's a conversation, a deeper conversation for a different time.
Yes.
Let's finish your thoughts on Metroid.
Sure. So I talked about the pacing, the mechanics of the level design. It's awesome. I'm sorry, I said mechanics when I meant to say, now let's talk about mechanics. The gameplay is butter smooth. It's 60 frames per second, and everything works. All the buttons, the responsiveness, you feel like you're in 100% control. Nothing in the game gets in your way of what you're trying to do. And so with the boss fights that are very difficult, it's literally you and nothing else but you. You can't grind your way up to be like stronger. You can't. There's nothing. There's no cheesy level mechanic or gimmick that gets in your way. There's no random RNG process. Like the bosses have a very set pattern. They react extremely predictably, and it's you as the player learning the boss patterns, learning how to dodge the fight, and like dodge and jump around, and knowing when the opening is there to present itself to attack. And
what does this sound like to me? Oh, this sounds so familiar.
Yeah.
Gosh, I wonder if there's an entire genre and developer of games that you've been ignoring that's the exact gameplay loop for.
The cool part is
it's missing. It's just going right over my head.
And the reason why this one is so appealing is because when you die, the game is awesome, and it has a nice little autosave checkpoint right before the boss door. So when you die, you just have to see a game over screen, and you press A, and you're right back at the boss fight again. And so you can die 20 times in like 15 minutes. And you just go. You just keep hitting. You just keep throwing yourself at the boss over and over and over again with nothing in the way. No backtracking. No silly like, my save point's all the way across the map, so I got to run through all this stuff again. Like, nope, you're right there. And so like when you fail, you're right there. When you fail, you're right there. And the same goes for... We've had this discussion
far too much for me to input with counter arguments, so I will just let that be what it is.
Yep. And what I was afraid of during the lead up and the promotions for Metroid Dread was this silly EMMI robot that's going to hunt you down. And I was immediately thinking of Mr. X
Tyrant,
from Resident Evil 2, which I hated. That was the worst. That ruined Resident Evil 2 remake.
I loved it.
Because that's not what Resident Evil 2 was. And they threw that thing in there, and it's like this constant oppressive force that's going to get you, and it stops like exploration and fully learning and like hanging out in the environments. And so you have to constantly keep moving, and there's always this tension. So I thought that's what was going to happen in Metroid Dread, but they've constrained the robots. There's 6 of them to respective locations only, and you are well aware when you are in their area. Like the music changes, and it has like a grainy film grain over its visuals. It's really, really cool, and you just have to get through that spot. And so it helps you like mentally prepare to get through it, and then know
they're much
just
more
get to that door. Just get on the other side of the door.
Huh? The encounters with them are more choreographed than they are.
It's just like a space,
organic,
and they are difficult. Like you do have to think about how to stealthily get through that spot. but you know where they are, and you end up like getting something that you can use to stop them eventually. So like you go back through it. It's really, really well done. And that was not a concern anymore, after I started playing through it. And that did not get in the way either. What made me remind me of that was there is also an auto checkpoint, because those EMMI robots will kill you instantly if you see them. There's a small chance you can like do your melee counter, but the window to actually do that is so tight, so hard. Like I very rarely ever had a chance to counter them. So when they touch you, you die, but you start right outside the door. So again, there's no obtuse loading from 3 minutes ago. You have to run through the entire level to get back to where you were. You're just right there. And so all that helps with the pacing. It's like, yes, this game is very difficult, but when you do die, there's zero consequence. You just start right back where you were, and you keep throwing yourself at it. And so all that combined with the excellent platforming, the expert level design, the perfectly well paced item upgrades and boss fights, like everything about the game was fantastic. There was a major story reveal that's huge for the game, for the entire franchise.
I was going to ask about that. We'll have to talk about that later.
The story is good. The plot points are great. Everything about this game, like if I had to put a number down, I would totally say this is a 10 out of 10. This is the best Switch game I've played since Breath of the Wild.
Nice. So, wow. Well, I might have to.
Absolutely fantastic.
If you lend it to me, then I have an excuse to come visit you soonly after you move. I'm just going to throw that out there.
You'll come all the way to Charlottesville.
I'll let that be in the universe. I mean, I would probably like visit other people, take the opportunity if that was even something realistically possible right now. But I'm more just joking. I'm not actually expecting anything from you. But it would be nice. Let it be known out there that Penguin doesn't necessarily want to invest in it himself yet until he knows if he'd like it. But you have sold me on wanting to try it for sure.
Yeah, this is if you've never really got into Metroid, you're going to hate every other Metroid except this one.
Oh,
if you
nice.
start here, all the rest are going to feel so much worse.
Wow.
So just be aware of that, because they have perfected the formula.
The game is, cool. All right, I know you had mentioned that you wanted to hit on the difficulty, but I feel like that's a conversation for another time. I think we need to have a redux.
Enough.
We talked about difficulty in an episode on difficulty settings, I believe, several episodes ago. I'll have to check our list, but I'm pretty sure we have had that conversation before. But I think that we had that conversation before Penguin had gone through some changes. And I don't think my opinion has entirely changed from that episode, but there are some differences and some nuances that I think that would be fun to revisit. So, and since you just played Metroid Dread and have been experimenting with more difficult games yourself, I think it's probably a good time to reconsider that conversation, especially as it continues to be relevant and it continues to be something that's talked about and debated hotly in the video game industry. So we will get around to adding that to our list and talk about that sometime probably early next year. But Metroid Dread and difficult games can sometimes be our favorite thing, but
doing this podcast is our favorite thing. Favorite things.
It's a segment of our show where we like to share with you something that we are excited about, something that we're digging, in hopes that you might go find your next favorite thing. So, Termite, what's your favorite thing?
My favorite thing...
I suppose I should probably go first since you just talked a lot about Metroid.
Well, you can do that. Go ahead.
Okay, well, yeah, I got mine off the top of my head. Is Pokemon Go, as I've mentioned before, that me and my son have been getting into. That he has been... It's like one of the few things that we both love to do and do together. So we've been playing Pokemon Go, and they're having their Halloween event. And I think that when I first played Pokemon Go, before my son was born, way back in 2017 or whatever when it came out, I don't think that I stuck around long enough to see what they did with Halloween. And maybe maybe it hasn't been in the intervening like 5 years. Maybe they've had different Halloween events and gotten better and better. But the one that's going on now is freaking awesome. Like, it's double candy for everything, including transferring Pokemon, catching Pokemon, hatching Pokemon. Everything gives you double the candy right now, which is great because it's Halloween, right? Like, it's thematic, it fits thematically. So it's just like, it's Evolution Fest in my house, man, which is awesome because my son loves when I get to evolve Pokemon.
Nice.
And I'm just catching ghost Pokemon left and right and just having a blast and getting all kinds of rewards, Pokeballs and stuff. So we're having...
And this is all in your neighborhood, right?
Yeah, I don't even have to really go anywhere. Now, granted, when I do get to go somewhere, it's even better because I could, if I get to go grocery shopping, there's Pokestops that I can hit up. And, we were just at church and I was just farming the Pokestops there. There's like 3 there. It's awesome. So there are, when I do get opportunities to get out and, do stuff, it's great. But I mean, I can just catch Pokemon at my house and then do all the, they have all these research tasks and quests basically now in the game that are independent of this Halloween event. And so just constantly stuff to do in the game from home. And it's just been fun. So yeah, I don't have a way to do everything in the game. I still can't do raids. like still get, like even if I'm in town and use a remote raid pass, like there's no one ever doing raids at the gyms that I'm doing. So like I have a whole quest that are like beat a mega raid, and I'm like, never gonna happen, probably ever. but it's fun, you know. So I'm still having fun, and more importantly, I can, you know, bond with my kid over it. So if you have an interest in Pokemon Go at all and just haven't been doing it, then it's you know, and maybe you haven't been doing it for logical reasons, right? Like the game, it's a cell phone game, right? It forces you to like, yeah, it has all these barriers and stuff, right? Like, but right now, a lot of those barriers are lessened because of this Halloween event. So you should check it out.
Yeah, I've lost interest in Pokemon Go because I turned on Adventure Sync, which is when like it tracks your distance walk.
It trivialized everything for you, yeah.
It did, and you get crazy rewards, which filled up my item spots. So now I can't activate any Pokestops because my item box is full, and I'm not going to put real world money into it to upgrade my item box.
No,
and so not. I also have caught 300 Pokemon because I want to keep one of each type to evolve it. So like I want a Bulbasaur, I want a Venusaur, and an Ivysaur. Sorry, it's out of order. Bulbasaur, Ivysaur, Venusaur. So I needed 3 Bulbasaur. So I'm doing that. So like I have a complete collection of Pokemon, and I have filled up to 300. And so I can't catch any more Pokemon unless I spend money to increase my Pokemon storage.
Yeah.
So I'm
you
stuck,
could,
and I'm
you
like,
could.
can't
so
catch Pokemon, can't hit stops, and that's it. So
yeah, the limits of free to play are burning you right now.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's enough about Pokemon Go. What's your favorite thing?
My favorite thing is we went to King's Dominion yesterday to do.
Nice. Did you get rained on?
We did.
I was thinking about you.
It's part of the favorite. Like, it was awesome.
Nice.
So when we showed up, what I hate about Virginia weather is that in October, it's hit or miss as far as fall things.
Yeah.
You can do a fall event, which is usually equated to pumpkin spice lattes and Ugg boots
crisp
and vests
air,
and crisp, cold,
beautiful leaves. All the leaves have changed. Yeah, no.
Yeah, that kind
Virginia,
of thing.
it's like
Virginia, you can get swampy summer. It's
I was gonna say you're just as likely to get. Yep,
it's gross. And so that's what the weather was when we showed up, and we knew there was rain in the forecast, and we were meeting some other extended family there, which was awesome. We had a great time. But when we arrived, a couple hours in, a breeze came in that was very strong. Clouds out of nowhere. I mean, it wasn't out of nowhere because we have phones that tell us. Yeah,
you told me like roughly when you were going to be there. We had considered actually going ourselves. I didn't tell you that we were until we had committed to it, and then we didn't end up committing to it. And in part because by the time we would have gone, we saw and it was going to be raining, and we were like, nah.
Yeah, and
that storm came out of nowhere.
Up. It dumped so
it was
hard.
Nuts.
Yeah. And we just
I was going to mow the lawn, and I was like, oh, well, dang it, that's not happening.
Nope. And so we sheltered into a store, and we bought candy for the kids, and they loved it. And we hung out for a while, and then we got some ponchos when the rain lightened up, and we continued to move through different rides and things. The crowd dispersed. Of course, it was awesome, so there was no lines for some of the kids' stuff. And we had a wonderful day. The food was kind of nuts because everyone did go to the restaurants, and the worker shortage is real. So all of the restaurants are understaffed, which means all the trash cans are overflowing. They're all kind of gross, and the lines take a ridiculously long amount of time, and there's might not be the food that you want available. And everyone's having a bad time because customers are waiting in line. They're all impatient, and the employees are furious because they're getting yelled at by customers, but they're also overworked and underpaid. So it's a whole situation that's very, very rare, very real, and very apparent at King's Dominion. I know, like, you can go to a restaurant and they'll talk about the shortage, but you don't really experience it or see it firsthand because you had a good experience. But at King's Dominion, like, that's where if you want to know anything about the worker shortage that's happening because of the pandemic.
Is it a worker shortage, or is it a people not willing to, or people willing to work for slave wages shortage?
Well, that's that's causality, right?
Right. I know. I'm being tongue in cheek. Yeah. I'm just being. It's sometimes it gets presented in the media as if it's like, oh, there's no one to work, or no one wants to work, is how it's often presented. And it's like,
depending on what kind of media
people want to work, they just want to work fairly. They just want to be compensated fairly for the work they're doing and not hate their lives. Is that too much to ask?
Exactly.
Yes, apparently that's too much to ask in our society. So whatever.
Yep.
All right, cool.
We had a great time as a family, and when the weather did clear up and the rain went away, it was very crisp. The humidity was gone. It was in the upper 60s, and it actually was good hoodie weather, and it was perfect for fall. So everything ended up wonderful, and we had a great time through dark, and then we came home when the park started to transition to the adult scary stuff, where I left it in sadness because I wanted to hang out and do scary stuff, but with the crisp fall weather, and I could not. So that was the end of the day. We came home, kids went to bed, and we all had a great time. So
King's Dominion at fall is awesome. Or
Yeah,
King's
it really
Dominion
is.
in October is awesome. So
Yep.
like, if you are local to Virginia, you should check it out because
Yes.
it's a good time. So
But just go with lots of patience for all of the employees and treat everyone nicely.
see, I want to go, but I don't think I'm gonna go eat. Like, I think that's gonna be the thing. Is like, I feel like I want to go and just like, if I can carve a pumpkin. I guess the pumpkin's gonna like stuff is gonna be operated by like people too. So maybe.
Oh yeah. Yep.
But I'm happy to just carve my own pumpkin at home. I was doing that before my King's Dominion
No, we didn't do
stuff
that.
anyways.
We just
so
rode rides. We didn't actually do any of the.
Well, my son doesn't.
Stuff.
Well, he's
just
getting
rode
older,
rides.
so maybe he does like rides now. We'll have to figure that out.
Yeah.
But anyways, so all right, cool, awesome. Well, that leaves us with a little bit of time to squeeze in our next segment, which is DLC. DLC stands for downloadable content. It is a segment of our show where we have a little fun discussion you wouldn't normally have about video games, prompted by something that may be inspired by our main topic and may not be. But tonight, our conversation and DLC conversation is because I want to do a mashup. So the way this is going to work is one of us is going to pick a Marvel character that we are pretty sure doesn't have an existing video game. So no Spider-Man, no Wolverine, no Guardians of the Galaxy or Avengers. So a Marvel character that, and if you aren't comfortable with that in regards to not knowing what Marvel characters do and may or may not. You got one?
Yeah.
Well, do you want that or do you want to pick the genre? Because wait, so the other one's going to pick a genre. We don't know what each other has picked. We haven't planned this ahead of time.
I want the character.
You do want the character. Okay. Yeah. All right. Then I'll pick the genre. I'm going to pick a video game genre. So a style of, genre gameplay or whatever. And we're basically going to see what that mashup looks like. What would that game look like with that character and that style of video game? I've got my genre.
If anyone is friends with Termite and you know what I am currently reading in the Marvel Universe, you will already know the character I'm about to pick.
Nice.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
It's a character who's actually a villain, and his name is Onslaught.
Good pick. Onslaught. Right. That is, hold on. That is X-Men, right? That's an X-Men thing?
It's an entire Marvel cinematic. Look at me. That's how you can tell I've been conditioned. It's an entire Marvel Universe villain. Everyone's involved. Okay. Punisher, Iron Man, Fantastic Four, Incredible Hulk, X-Men, Spider-Man, everyone.
Well, sweet. This is going to be fun then. I think I'm going to like this mashup because my genre that I've picked before I knew what your character was is the tower defense genre. Tower defense strategy games, specifically.
Whoa.
So
I haven't thought about that in a long time.
Right? Onslaught, with the specific, subgenre of strategy games, real-time strategy games that is often referred to as tower defense, where you basically think of like, I guess Plants vs. Zombies, kind of like a well-known tower defense game where you are basically building, basically you've got all the enemies are moving towards a specific point. And that if they destroy that point, then you lose. And so your job as the strategist, as the player, is to build towers or build defenses. It doesn't have to necessarily be towers to be considered a tower defense game. But the idea is that you are the one to build the defenses and have to cleverly come up with ways to prevent. And again, there gets more and more hordes of enemies and harder enemies and, with different stuff. That's kind of how the genre works if you're not familiar with tower defense. So what would a Onslaught tower defense game look like? My first initial thought is that's awesome because as the villain, you're probably fighting against heroes. So you're going to have first the little grunt units are just going to be like law enforcement, right? And you're mowing them down. But then eventually, as the game goes on, you're going to have events basically where superheroes come in, right? And so, I was about to say Superman, like an idiot. We're talking about Marvel here. So Captain America shows up and he's got a whole special moveset. So you need specific types of, towers and stuff or defenses in order to, deal with him. But you are more familiar with the game, so you could probably speak more to what the defenses would look like, right? What are his powers and what are his, minions, or if he has those, what does that look like?
Well, he's all psychic. He's the uber psychic person.
Gotcha.
So anything with telekinesis and mind control and mind reading, all of those things, pretty much Professor Xavier and Jean Grey, but on steroids.
Right.
Onslaught is way more powerful.
So would he would you be able to unlock and mind control Magneto basically and basically recruit? Oh, that's awesome. I love it.
Yeah. I was exactly what I was going for. Is also he is in control of all of the villains or the opposition antagonist stuff from all of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I say cinematic again. I'm sorry. The comic universe. At the beginning of the comics, Juggernaut is scared of Onslaught and actually attacks the X-Men mansion to try and get Professor Xavier's attention and the attention of the X-Men in general, because he's terrified of how bad Onslaught is. This is Juggernaut, who is like the arch enemy of the X-Men. So, and that helmet he has does not bode well for Onslaught's psi energy that he has. Because
right, you know that in the comics, Juggernaut was Professor Xavier's brother, I think.
Sounds right.
Yep, and
there's
so
a relationship there that I'm not aware of. So
and
I'll
so
give you that.
But that's why he wears the helmet, wrong, just like Magneto, is to prevent Xavier, his brother, from mind controlling him.
Onslaught's way more powerful, and he is in tune completely with all the psi stuff, and he puts people in the psi world. That's PSY or PSI psi world, and so there's a whole like meta universe of that where like
that would work so well in a tower defense game. You could have like pockets where it sends them to the psi world, and or you're having maybe you have like maybe Xavier is one of the levels you have to fight against him. He's invading, and so like you have to also set up tower defense or your defenses in the psi world as well. Like that'd be awesome. That would work great. I love this mashup already. Make this game, Marvel.
Yeah. And then of course every single hero in all of Marvel Universe across every comic they've ever produced is in this event. So you can do that. Like you can have any superhero come through your tower defense and have like an entire strategy with which to beat that specific hero. So
and like in multiple right, and then you could have like so as you're working your way through the different scenarios or campaigns, like the culmination, like chapter ending big missions where it's like you have to use all the tools and all of your strategy. Those are all where you're fighting the different groups of heroes. So you have one where you're fighting the Fantastic Four, one where you're fighting the Avengers, one where you're fighting blah blah blah. Who knows? Like there could be all signs. That would be awesome.
Some of the like lesser known groups are in there too, like X Factor.
Yeah, Guardian.
And there's other ones too that I've read the comics and still can't even remember.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Yeah,
awesome, sweet. Well, great. I loved that. That worked so well as DLC. We're vibing today, apparently. All right. Well, that's DLC. We want to hear what your thoughts are. What kind of? Well, first of all, what do you think of our mashup of Onslaught's tower defense game? And do you have a character or genre that you think would be fun to mash up from the Marvel or DC or whatever Lord of the Rings mashup, whatever? We want to hear all those thoughts and more. Termite, where can listeners, DLC fans, share their cool DLC ideas if they have them?
Start by going to 80bitpodsmash.com, 80bitpodsmash.com. That's our main website where we have links to all of our social media outlets where you can get in touch with us. Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, Twitter, as well as a Discord server that is active. And the link for that is in all of our show notes, so you can interact with us the easiest way through those media methods. And you can also find links to all of our podcast platforms if you are finding us on a platform you don't prefer and you want a different one. There's Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Google Play, Apple Podcasts, etc., as well as our RSS feed that you can throw into any third-party app of your choice. So please go check out 80bitpodsmash.com, 80bitpodsmash.com.
Sweet. We can jump into the topic now, what everyone who probably clicked on this episode was waiting for us to finally talk about, beyond just our silly DLC conversation. So we're talking about Marvel, we're talking about video games, and where those two meet up, right? So Marvel's approach to video games is very different from their approach to comics and movies, and we want to talk about that. I feel like I didn't necessarily pick this conversation because of the time of year. It's going to be November by the time people are listening to this, just after Halloween. I don't know of any thing that's coming out Marvel wise, so I'm not trying to necessarily piggyback off of any kind of hype. I guess Hawkeye is the next big thing to come out, and the Eternals, I guess, is coming out this month too. Maybe that was my original thought, but either way,
and Guardians of the Galaxy just released.
The game, that's listening to this, right? Maybe that's what
Guardians of the Galaxy game is coming out across all the consoles. It came out October 26th.
Yep, that's probably it. That's probably what I was looking at. So either way, this is the time of year where lots of Marvel stuff happens. Marvel has kind of become synonymous with Hollywood at this point, right? Like Marvel and Disney are just kind of dominating the box office right now. And
Eternals is the movie in theaters that's happening November 5th.
Yep,
so go look for that. Spider-Man is next month in December.
Wow. So it's just, there's so much Marvel activity that happens this time of year, and there's just, in general, Marvel is just, there have been, before the pandemic and before I sort of just swore off of going to see movies due to both the pandemic and my current life situation in general with my kids, there was a point at which I was just like, I can only see 5 movies a year, and 3 out of those 5 movies are probably going to be Marvel movies. Like they just are. They are culture. They are the culture right now, at least as it relates to movies. And so,
there's like Academy Award winning movies, and then there's Marvel. Which sometimes
exactly,
they
right?
overlap. Sometimes they're like with each other. But there's the big high quality dramas that are out there that people will go see, and then there's Marvel. That's
Yeah,
pretty
well,
much
and
it.
then there's like,
There's horror movies too.
well, there's a lot. But what I guess, since you bring that up, there's this huge discussion right now in the cinema universe as to whether or not Marvel movie, it's the same thing that happened with video games, right? That we tackled in the very first episode, which is, do video game or are Marvel movies have artistic merit, or are they just pure entertainment? I'd argue that all art entertainment is a form of artistic and therefore has some artistic merit. But I'd make that argument for video games, so I'll make it for Marvel, of course. But nevertheless, it's still something that's discussed. Is you have gosh, who was it? There was some big famous director that was like, Marvel movies are not true cinema or something like that. And it's like, so you still have this sort of idea, and whether it's directed at Marvel or whether it's directed at video games, I find the entire discussion to be patronizing in general. But at the same time, I do see where they're coming from some extent, which is just this idea that it's like Marvel has sort of perfected this formula and they don't really deviate from the formula. So I can see where people might get kind of sick of it because they just have been dominating for so long, and I can see where there's that fatigue, right? There's sort of that fatigue with Marvel movies. And now basically for actors, you haven't made it until you've had a Marvel role, right? Like Marvel has become synonymous with success at this point for actors. And I can see where that might rub people the wrong way. So anyways, that's kind of some basic context. Let's roll things back even further though. Before Marvel was dominating movies, who were they and what did they do?
Marvel games, Marvel comics.
Yes, they were originally a comic book.
Everything. Sorry, there's so many different facets to answer that question with.
Right.
We have to there are entire podcasts that come out with episodes every week or bi-weekly that involve the Marvel universe.
That have been going on for years. Marvel is huge. We're trying to cover this in 30 minutes.
Tip of the iceberg here of what Marvel is. So comic books, superheroes, Spider-Man, the Avengers, X-Men, Iron Man. I mean, that's Marvel. So they're a comic book media outlet, I guess. There's digital comics, there's physical comic books, and we've just talked at length about the TV shows and the movies and all the spin-offs and all the things. Currently, they're owned by Disney. Yep. That was a huge acquisition that happened pretty recently. When I say recently, within the last 5 years. And so now there's this new subscription service, Disney Plus, that now houses pretty much all of Marvel's TV shows and movies that have come out, with the exception of a few licensing disagreements among Sony. And so it's a big deal. It's crazy. So it is all encompassing in every aspect of our pop culture now, when they were originally kind of niche and more of comic books. And I mean, the original X-Men movie and the first Spider-Man movie came out in 2000 to 2005, somewhere in that time. So in the movie world, which is really where pop culture mainstream took off, it hasn't been there. They've been some cartoon shows and some small adaptations, but mostly comic books across, that whole spectrum. So there's a lot of heroes. There's an insane amount of content.
Sure. I mean, they've been doing this since they were founded in 1939. So again, people seem to think that Stan Lee was synonymous with Marvel's founding, but actually goes back before Stan Lee. The Marvel was making comics under that name since a guy named Martin Goodman. He published a pulp magazine called Marvel Comics, and that was in 1939. So that's they go back even further than that. And we're not going to jump into the complete history of Marvel, but that's where their origin is, right? So they've always been making comics, and of course they're most known for their big superhero properties, which the Avengers are not their biggest property, or at least originally weren't their biggest property. They were most known for in the 90s and the 80s for Spider-Man and X-Men. Were their two biggest properties, conveniently for a long time owned by Sony or Sony and Fox respectively. So it wasn't until, again, one of the big crazy things that made Marvel Cinematics, Marvel movies, Marvel Studios, I think is what it's called now. What made Marvel Studios so successful was that they were able to take their lesser known superhero groups and superheroes and make great movies with them. And that is kind of what attributes their success. But they are not the first great superhero stories or superhero movies. This is comics and superheroes just have such a crazy deep history. You're right. We can't barely cover it in one full episode, but I did want to kind of hit just that major highlight there. So they were making games before they were making movies, like big movies though, big blockbusters though. So
video games, they have been. We're going to go into that.
Yeah, we'll go into that.
Marvel Comics games have been around since the 80s.
Cool. So I want to talk a little bit personally though. I want to get personal real quick before we move on, and I want to talk about your opinion. What is your opinion on Marvel in general, whether it's comics, movies, or games? Do you prefer Marvel or do you prefer DC in any of those categories? And do you have a favorite Marvel character, and what is that character?
No, I definitely have all answers to all of these questions. I love Marvel. I have been a Marvel fan since I can remember. I was born a Marvel fan. Like, Marvel superheroes have been in my memory forever. I don't remember a time when I didn't know who like Iron Man and Spider-Man and X-Men were. It's kind of like children come out of the womb knowing who Batman is. In fact, I had a funny conversation with my son. He mentioned Joker, and I was like, what do you think of when I say Joker? And he goes, Batman. I'm like, how? You've never watched the show. You don't know any of the movies. You are way too young to see any of that stuff. So, like, how do you know? Anyway, I digress. That's me with Marvel. I know and love Marvel. I always have. I dabbled in comics, but mostly cartoons with the more 90s, late 80s adaptations of Iron Man and X-Men and Spider-Man. We
talked about this. I think we covered some of this in our episode, our superhero episode, but it's worth reiterating. Comics are the more expensive habit, bar none.
They really are.
Like, bar none in regards to, like, entertainment per dollar.
Yes.
Like, entertainment hour per dollar. Comic books are going to run you more than video games, period. Just saying.
I have been buying recently as an adult. I bought The Last Ronin, is a comic book written by the original writers of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle comic books, and they've gotten back together and they've come out with a new series of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle comics called The Last Ronin. It's 5 issues. They're $8 a piece, and they take a half hour to read. If that.
Nuts.
You go buy the new book and you're like, sweet. And you sit down and you're like, oh, it's only been a half hour. I'm done.
Yeah, and that's nuts. That's insane.
8 times 5 is $40, and you're going to get maybe
2.5 hours. Yeah. For $40, you can buy Kena Bridge of Spirits, and get like 20 hours out of it, depending on if you want to platinum it. 12 to 15 hours out of it, if you don't platinum it. Like, again, some would argue that's still too much money per entertainment, but that's just the bottom. That's the short end of the video game spectrum. Like,
it's actually just as bad as movie theaters, because to take two people to go to a modern movie theater, a good one,
started
would be $40. Yeah, $40 for 2 people to go, and you would get a 2-hour experience.
Yeah, people judge video games for being such an expensive habit, but
they're not at all.
Like, whether you're and within the video game community, we debate whether or not it's more cost effective to console game versus PC game. But we're all sitting here on our little branch. We're all sitting on our perch of, like, having probably, whether you're PC or video or console gamer, you still probably have the cheapest entertainment per dollar, like entertainment dollar per hour entertainment value of any other form of entertainment on the market, except for maybe novels, I guess, like books. But I digress as well. Sorry, go on, carry on though. What do you prefer? Do you prefer Marvel and DC?
Absolutely, yeah. Like, DC is garbage to me compared to Marvel. I should not say DC is not objectively garbage, and there are things in the DC comic universe that I do enjoy, but I have never read a single page of any DC comic my entire life. I've watched the movies. I've played some DC comic video games. I've watched. I know who Batman is. I've seen every Batman movie, except for the Ben Affleck one. I didn't watch that. And there's a new one coming out apparently, and that's weird. So
with Robert Pattinson, and actually
I don't even know who that is.
He's the dude from Twilight. He was the vampire in Twilight, Edward. But like, I saw the trailer for it. I watched it yesterday.
Yeah, it came out yesterday. Yeah.
It looks so dark. It's like they were basically like, how can we do what the Christian Bale era of Batman did, but then just like make it even more dark and intense? I don't know how I feel about it yet, but my instinct is to say, I love it.
All right. Yeah. Okay. But I do want to watch the trailer, and I'm interested. I played the Batman games, the Arkham series. Those 3 games are absolutely amazing.
Yeah, we'll get to
some
games.
of the best heroes
Let's
games.
Move it along, because I do want to talk about games.
Yeah. So. My single favorite Marvel character, you asked this last part of the question, is Spider-Man. Nothing has ever knocked Spider-Man off the throne. I absolutely adore everything Spider-Man has ever been in, every video game, every cartoon. There's some bad games back in the early Super Nintendo days, but I love Spider-Man. I love everything he is, his power set, his move set, his personality, just everything about Spider-Man, where it's set, all of it. It's fantastic. So Spider-Man it is.
All right. So my answers to these questions, I like Marvel in general. I mean, that's the short answer, right? Like, I have my bones to pick with Marvel. Like I said, there's that sort of superhero bubble and fatigue that I'm just sort of like, I thought was going to pop years ago, and I guess it didn't. So I guess I was wrong about that. But I've got a bit. I will say I got a bit of Marvel fatigue only because they do dominate so much, but like I also can't blame them because they are still putting out consistently good content in the space of comics and in the space of movies for sure. They have always put out pretty consistently good content. Not always. They've put out more hits than misses, I would argue.
Yes.
Games is a different story, but we'll circle back around to that, of course. Do I prefer Marvel or DC? I'm with you, man. I grew up with Spider-Man and X-Men, but I also grew up with Batman and Superman, and don't have as much love for Superman, but Batman for all of Superman's faults, Batman makes up for them tenfold in regards to, like, DC's quality, right? And so Batman as a host unto himself is just, like, freaking awesome and still one of the very best superhero franchises out there. So whether I prefer them or not, it's a much harder question because, once again, depends on the context. If you're talking movies, I prefer Marvel. I like Marvel's approach. Marvel built it from the ground up smartly. DC tried to piggyback off of what they were doing, but also still tried to maintain the dark, like the level of weighty darkness of the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy, and that was a bad choice, right? Like they're super, you can't take the same level of serious intensity that you have with Christian Bale and Christopher Nolan's Batman and try to apply that to Aquaman or Superman. Like, no, they're entirely different characters. Give them entirely different feels to their stories. So, yeah, I hate the way that DC has approached movies, but I love DC's animated. And DC's cartoons are way better, far and beyond what anything Marvel's ever put out in the animated space. And their games, I think, have a consistently better more consistency and quality, and part of that is due to what we'll discuss later. But we're not talking about DC here, so yeah, I'm Marvel. I have a love-hate, there are some things I love about Marvel, some things I hate about Marvel, and once again, the context depends. So on what you're talking about, but as far as just the pure comics go, I feel like they're really neck and neck. They both have really great characters. They both have really great storylines. They both have some awful, terrible, stupid crap in each case, and they also are they mostly hit the same notes. And that's what's ultimately, I think, the failure of superhero stories is there's only so many stories you can tell in that space that are interesting. Eventually, You're going to start repeating and copying one another, and it gets a little samey, right? So, all things considered. So, yeah, there is definitely a revolution in that space that is necessary, I think. So, anyways, cool. Well, let's finally talk about video freaking games. What is Marvel's history with video games? How/why did they decide to break into the industry? And what were their great successes and what were their great failures?
I don't know the great successes, great failures, other than my own experience with them. But Marvel games started in the 80s. That's their history. Marvel Properties group, they spun off a games division called Marvel Entertainment, and they have been, I guess if you just look back, the strategy that Marvel has now with games has been kind of the whole trend forever, and that is let's get other publishers and game studios to make, like, licensing out the IP and let them make a Marvel game. So instead of like Marvel driving their own games out of their own development studio or their own publishing arm, it's more or less like licensing out the superheroes to whoever wants to spend the money to buy the license.
But that's a Disney strategy. That's not necessarily contrast that to LucasArts, right? Before they were bought by Disney, there was LucasArts, and they drove and created their own games and were innovating in those spaces. And then they got bought by Disney, and Disney's like, nah, we'll let someone else do it. And that's because of Disney's troubled history with video games and Disney's failure to launch. But contrast that to, once again, it's so hard to talk about Marvel without talking about DC. But contrast that to DC. Warner Brothers bought DC, and now Warner Brothers is like, they have their own video game, like, publishing arm, and they'll hire different developers to make the games, but they still retained like a heavy creative control over the games that are made. And I think it works better. That's why I was saying they put out more consistently good games. But sorry, didn't mean to completely derail your thoughts there. Then.
So, if you look through like the 80s, you have Activision, which will come into context later, Acclaim, Sega, Konami, Capcom. They all made games, huge amounts of, like, Capcom was focusing on the fighting games that had happened. Acclaim was doing a lot of the platformers that went to consoles like PlayStation and, of course, Super Nintendo and Sega
lots
Genesis.
Of Spider-Man games. Holy crap. Not surprising. Not surprising at all. Yeah.
Sega was making their own Spider-Man games in the early 90s for Sega Genesis. Their own X-Men 1 and 2 on the Genesis are some of my two favorite Sega Genesis games, hands down. Like, they're awesome. And they have a crazy history of tons and tons
and
tons
they're
of
putting
games.
it out on everything.
Every console.
Arcade,
Everything.
NES, Game Boy, DOS, like freaking X-Men 2, Fall of Mutants is a DOS game. That's nuts. Like, that's back in the 80s. I did not realize how much stuff Marvel's been putting out in that time period. Like, I think of Marvel versus Capcom, of course. I think of the old Spider-Man arcade games and stuff like that, and the beat-em-ups with X-Men. But I'm looking at this list and my jaw is about to drop, like, because, this is pre, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, pre X-Men 1 and 2 that Fox put out. Those are the movies that really kicked off the superhero trend, and this is pre all of that, and there's still just hundreds, it feels like, of games, or at least
and
dozens.
That whole, like, the movies coming out was a giant injection of hype around Marvel, and now there's video game tie-ins to those movies. So there were an entire strand of Spider-Man games based on Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. And there was X-Men games with Hugh Jackman on the cover, like Wolverine's Revenge, X2. It came out on PS2. And
that's
Xbox,
a trend that has, oh gosh, that's another thing we need to cover. That's a trend that has sort of died, where you just have like these tie-ins to these like garbage games that have just come out. But not all of them are garbage, not gonna lie. I mean, some of the Spider-Man tie-in games to the movies, Sam Raimi's movies, were great. The first one and Spider-Man 2 are highly regarded as some of the best Spider-Man games ever. So I can't really even criticize the approach too much, because that is also a thing that happened.
Yeah, Activision was the primary publisher of all things Marvel through the 2000s, like after those movies had come out. So they really locked down the publishing rights there. And then, in the 2010s, still a lot of Activision, but that's when Marvel Games started making some of their own mobile games, like the mobile market hit. And again, it's a whole slew of Marvel games coming out, from 2010s through now, the 20s. And then Disney happened when Disney bought Marvel, and then things started to change and become a little bit more streamlined. I think the quality has gone up since then in all regards for Marvel games, but we can talk about that in different ways as you want to shake out that conversation. So that's the history. Why did they decide to break into the industry? Well, Marvel lends itself well to video games in general. I mean, every single superhero, the different types of powers they have are shoe-ins for game mechanics and conflict and fighting and beat-em-ups and platformers and all the stuff you can think around what was happening in the video game space. Just easy, like Marvel characters. Let's do it. Like, you can have all that stuff. You have co-op games, multiplayer, competitive games across every single genre. There's Marvel everywhere. There's card games. There's free-to-play mobile games. There's tower defense stuff out there. Everything you can think of, except for like racing. There's probably a Marvel racing game out there.
Probably.
I would not.
Just browse through this list. You'll eventually find it.
Yep.
Yeah, I think of Marvel games, and I think of I probably would agree that overall the quality has gone up, but like, I don't know, I still feel like Marvel, because of their approach of just kind of like, licensing it out all over the place, it's just not, it's not the same as their movies or even their comics have been in the past, where it's kind of a unified front of quality. And you've got, I don't know, like, you got on the one hand, and then you have all those weird licensing crossover things due to their crazy contracts and stuff over the years. I mean, I think people fail to recognize that in the overall grand scheme of things, Marvel was dying in the late 2000s. Movies and TV had sort of just kind of crushed the comic book market in a way that was pretty definitive at the time.
It's interesting to think about, because 2008 was the market crash, the big giant recession that the United States went through, which affected the global market as well. And you're right, like, there was this dip in everything. I mean, consoles were on the line, as far as like people were questioning the next generation of consoles are even viable, because PC gaming space was eating their lunch with like Steam and a race to the bottom in prices, and then cell phone games were coming out with the free-to-play model and the microtransactions, and they were wrecking the entire gaming industry. And people they didn't have the expendable income to go to the movies or like to buy extra stuff like comic books. So just general like entertainment lulled through that end of the aughts. So it makes sense.
And yet there were like more games coming out than ever, because development cycles were a lot shorter at the time. It's weird and complicated. But even before the whole video game stuff, like just in regards to like their comics were dying, and so they wanted to try to break into movies, but they didn't have Marvel Studios yet, and they hadn't piggybacked off of Disney's success until that wouldn't come until the 2010s. So what did they do? They licensed it off to Sony and licensed it off to Fox, who were making movies to make, Spider-Man and X-Men respectively. And those movies are great. And they began, that coupled with what would happen with Lord of the Rings a little bit later, where it was just suddenly sci-fi fantasy adaptation blockbusters. Everything was suddenly starting to like move towards mining nostalgia and mining, stories that hadn't been told in that space effectively at all. And then it kind of from there blew up, and Marvel was eventually, they had made enough money and made enough contacts and experience to, decide to now do it themselves. And they started with Iron Man and made the Avengers, and the rest is history, right? But like, they were so close to just fading into obscurity. They were so close to dying off. And, they made a couple of good contract choices. The irony being now those contract choices have bitten them in the butt, because now half of their characters, most successful characters, are owned or were owned previously by properties that they did not have intellectual property control over in the movie space. And so that extends to the video game space as well. Sony has some ownership rights over Spider-Man movie. Well, they have ownership rights over Spider-Man movies, but they also have some ownership rights over Spider-Man games.
Well, this is interesting, actually. So Insomnia, before they made Spider-Man and before they were owned by Sony, they were presented from Disney Marvel with the idea that they were going to make a Marvel game, and they got to choose any superhero they wanted. So Insomniac was not locked into Spider-Man at all because of Sony or anything relationship.
Right,
You're right.
Yeah.
That was totally segmented to just the film space. Sony had has still Spider-Man rights in the film era side of things. In the gaming spaces, there were other games that Spider-Man was not on locked to Sony platforms, such as like everything, but more recently,
all the
Marvel
Activision
Ultimate
Spider-Man
Alliance 3,
games,
all of those games, all the Activision ones, the movie, old Lego Marvel superheroes had Spider-Man in all of them. Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite was on all the platforms, and Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3 was a Nintendo Switch game. So like Spider-Man was everywhere in the gaming space. But we had this weird, interesting chain of events where Insomniac Games decided to choose Spider-Man and made an amazing Sony-exclusive Spider-Man game, which then resulted in Sony buying
purchase.
Insomniac internally. And then
so now, once again,
and
now you have this weird circumstance where, like, Square Enix had to add Spider-Man to their Avengers game as a Sony exclusive character because they literally couldn't put him on. It's so weird and so complicated. And like I said, again, we'll probably go into more detail in our DC episode if we ever do it. But like DC's everything that's coming out DC is now coming out from the Warner Brothers, video game arm, WB Games or whatever. And like, I can't help but respect the consistency of that over, you got, on the one hand, in just the last few years, we've seen a handful of Marvel games. We saw Marvel Ultimate Alliance 4, right? Came out like a few years ago. And then you had 3. Was it 3? 3?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
That was on the Switch.
Lost track of the numbers. Yeah, and that was not well received. You have Avengers, which was not really well received as a Square Enix live service game. But then you have Spider-Man and Miles Morales for, the Sony coming out of the Insomniac and Sony space, and they were adored and loved. So it's still this wildly, inconsistent level of quality, and I think you still have that in the DC space, don't get me wrong, but on the whole, like, DC games seem to be pretty solid under the direction of WB Games in general. I don't know if I can say which approach is better necessarily, but I seem to in general have a higher regard for DC games, I think, than I do Marvel games. Just because of this level of just like, okay, what are you doing, guys? Like, get it together. It together. And it just sucks because you have these weird contracts and deals where it's like you can't just make Marvel games like you can Marvel movies anymore. And that's like, I don't know how I feel about that. So.
And it would have been interesting if Disney did decide to stand up like a Marvel Games studio and hired like industry vets from various dev studios and like got them all together and then started cranking out like specific Marvel games, whether they'd be platform like specific on PlayStation or Xbox or whatever, like irrelevant, but that would have been entirely different because that's kind of what they did in the Marvel Cinematic Universe with Kevin Feige and like the same actors and getting them across 20 some movies and having this coherent what's canon and what's not. And it's been ever since Iron Man happened. I don't even know what year that was. If they'd have done the same thing in the gaming space, that would have been astronomically expensive, and that's probably why that didn't happen.
Yeah.
Also extremely risky because we don't know, like the gaming market is very volatile. What's popular and what's not is very unpredictable. And standing up a game is a 5-year development cycle and 100, 200, 300, $400,000. And like, it's a major investment, and you have stockholders and shareholders and investors, and all those things all complicate the waters. So it does make sense to me from like a business perspective that Marvel would say, you know what, Square Enix, you have development experience, so we're going to let you do the Marvel's Avengers thing. Have at it, like go do that. And then they took it and ran with it. Or even backing up even farther, where it was Guardians of the Galaxy, the Telltale series. You look at Telltale Games and like making the action adventure games. Let's do that. Capcom, you make great fighting games. You can keep making Marvel versus Capcom.
Right.
The Lego games that are all made by Traveler's Tales, like you guys make great Lego games, so you have at it. Just like farming out all the different resources.
Sure. I feel
that makes sense, but in execution and what we're getting, like you said, is unpredictable. Like we know, because we just had the major announcements of the new Wolverine game. Like we're so excited because that's Insomniac. They have a track record. They've proven themselves.
Yep, and they did so good with Spider-Man.
But we have this Guardians of the Galaxy, which is like Avengers sequel, same company. It's like that looks like a multiplayer live servicey game, but it's centered around Guardians of the Galaxy, and it's kind of like a bunch of question marks. Is it going to be good?
Right.
We don't really know. Is it samey? Is it just like Marvel's Avengers, which didn't do too well? And
it's so hard because of Marvel's, just like I said, cultural dominance right now. It's so hard for, I think, even players to not think of the movies too, right? So you have, we spent so much time talking about movies in this episode, and because we had to, because just of what Marvel is. I would have loved to have just spent more time talking about video games because they're two separate things, but you can't talk about one without the other in this space right now because of how, like I said, just how big of a monolith that Marvel is. But like, you have all these controversies, like people, they got different actors and they portrayed the characters to look slightly different from the movies, but also still with that same vibe that the movies were able to do for each of the characters, and they got like criticism for that. But then again, on the other hand, you have Spider-Man, and you had the actor who played Peter Parker in the new Spider-Man games that Insomniac did, and didn't get nearly as much criticism for him not looking like Tom Holland. But then they made him look like Tom Holland in the rematch, like more like Tom Holland in the remaster, and they got criticized for that. It's like, it's so, and again, fan criticism is a beast and a conversation all unto itself, and doesn't necessarily need to be hit on. But like, you have just, at the end of the day, you still have this weird like thing where in people's heads they have a hard time separating the games from the movies, and I wonder if that would be different if all the games focused more on trying to not create these characters to look and feel like they do in the movies, but instead focus more on making these characters look and feel like they do in the comic books. Because nobody sits there and criticizes Marvel versus Capcom for the characters not like, Wolverine not looking like Hugh Jackman, because his costume and everything's right out of the comics. Everything looks right exactly like out of the comics. And so, again, there's, people still seem to make space for this dichotomy between the comic book character's appearance and the movie's appearance. But then when you make that jump to video games, and if you try to do something unique and different in the video game space, then suddenly it becomes weirdly controversial. But that's because that's not necessarily, I'm not even going to blame the players and the critics for that aspect of it. That's solely just a fact that Marvel has become synonymous now with movies, even more than they ever were with comics, I think. And so when people think of Marvel, they're going to think of the movies, and that's going to somehow affect the video games that are made, especially if those video games are trying to go for more of that movie vibe than the comic vibe. I don't think that's a good thing. I really wish that games could just like not have to constantly, and like I said, again, bringing up DC one more time, you don't see that with DC stuff. You don't see people being like, oh, Batman doesn't look like Christian Bale, that's not Batman. Right? And in fact, the Batman Arkham games have the same voice actors from the cartoons, and it works so well. Mark Hamill is the Joker in that. Mwah, Très magnifique. And yeah, it just doesn't seem to be a problem on the other end of the table. So I don't know. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, you covered it. Based on what I said and what you said, like, I don't know what else there is to say.
Well, sweet. Then why don't we just end with our last question here? What do you want to see more or less of from Marvel video games in the future?
I love
this is our
Sony,
chance to give you guys free IDs.
Yes, like I'm obsessed with Insomniac games and what they're doing with Marvel. I don't want to see Insomniac games become a Marvel factory. I want
Uh-huh.
Insomniac
Yep.
Games to continue doing what they
Please.
used to do,
Yes.
which was awesome. Ratchet and Clank was amazing.
Yeah, more Ratchet and Clank, please.
Yeah, and I want Insomniac Games to make new IP that we don't know about. So when I say that, I'm both extremely excited but also apprehensive about Insomniac Games. So what Marvel is doing with them specifically is exactly what we need more of, and I hope the success of Spider-Man continues to push the single player big epic story narrative to not emphasize the multiplayer aspects of games as a service that we're seeing with Avengers.
Yes,
and I like
gosh.
the discourse that's actually happening, where you have the high quality single player experience as the creme de la creme, and you have this multiplayer shoe in that's kind of like limping along. And they fixed it. I mean, they've done a lot of work on it, and they just can't seem to catch a break. I remember the most recent big giant update. They had the doxing issue that I talked about, where they showed our IP address. And it's like the Black Panther update came out. It was this massive big deal. And so like every time they make a new initiative through the Square Enix, I guess it's Eidos Montreal. I'm not 100% sure. It's just off the top of my head. So what I want to see in the future regarding Marvel is just higher quality content. And I want to see Disney continue to pair themselves with the best developers out there to do that. And the reason why I'm hopeful is because Disney also owns Star Wars, and Star Wars was under the EA license for however many years that was. I can't remember now. And EA botched everything about Star Wars. You saw that with the Battlefront series, and that's just they've canceled some of the best games, and they finally got one big hit, which was Respawn Entertainment's Jedi Fallen Order, and it was a super successful game, and everyone loved it, but guess what? It's single player, and it was awesome. And so that continues to drive the conversation and hopefully the dollars towards single player experiences, and I want to see the same strategy play out from the Disney wing as in Marvel. So now Disney is partnering with various other people to make good Star Wars games, and I think we have to do a whole episode about Star Wars now. I think we're in a good spot.
We did everything Star Wars episode a long time ago.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
So go back and listen to that for more thoughts on that. But I think with Disney doing that correctly on the Star Wars front, I think there's a lot of potential for Disney to do this correctly on the Marvel front.
We have had one great Star Wars game since EA's, downfall, so to speak, in that space. So hopefully that continues. That I agree. I like that, but I hope that continues and doesn't actually.
My last thought. Look at what's coming that we've announced in the future. We haven't really talked about what Marvel games have been announced and what's currently the landscape as it is right now. So we have Guardians of the Galaxy, which should have already been released before this, and hopefully that was done or received well, because that was Eidos Montreal. Then we have Marvel's Midnight Suns by Fire Axis, the XCOM style Marvel game, which is a very unique take, something very new and fresh that we can't really...
More strategy.
I think it's great. Like, I've looked at the gameplay. It looks enticing. I want to play it. I think it's got a lot of potential. And the reason why I even highlighted and bring that up is because they're doing different things with Marvel franchise IP than we've seen before. And so this is cool. It's not just the single player third person action slasher. It's also not this multiplayer games as a service game. It's a whole new thing. It's a tactical kind of RPG, but even a twist on that. It's not just XCOM. It's actually different. So go check that out. And we know we have Wolverine and we have Marvel Spider-Man 2 coming out of Insomniac. So those are continuing to push that side of Marvel, which is awesome. So I think they're headed in a good direction.
I hope so. So my answer to the question of what I want to see more or less of, I think I would like to see them dial it back. Take everything, stop trying to blow your load too soon, so to speak. Doing Avengers, having Square Enix do Avengers or Crystal Dynamics and all that, I think that was a mistake. Especially trying to do it as a live service game. Huge mistake. Totally didn't see the writing on. They totally didn't see the writing on the wall for that one. We've been talking about live service games and their downfall since long before Avengers, I think, was even in the works. So
there's too many of them.
Yeah,
the
exactly.
Space is too crowded.
It's not right, and it's the entire purpose of that space is to dominate attention. You need your game to be the only game people play, and that eventually you're going to cannibalize off of each other. Anyways, that's just to say that dial it back. And what I think what most attracted me to the Avengers game in the first place was this idea that each hero was going to feel unique. So I think to myself, then why do them all together and then therefore water down the experience with mechanical benchmarks they all have to hit, when instead you should be doing exactly what Insomniac did, which was make a game that feels unique and feels good to play for each character. Imagine a game where it's just Captain America and it's this gritty war, third person. I say third-person shooter, but obviously he doesn't use guns, but third-person shield melee game, almost like a faster-paced Souls game that doesn't have to be necessarily, but still that third-person action melee game would be awesome. Captain America feels unique, feels solid, feels good to play. Same with Thor. Like, you got Thor, you got the whole, like, returning hammer mechanic. That's God of War right there. Like, and the mythology and everything. Like, they can do that. We know that game developers can do this and make these games feel good. And that's what Marvel should be focusing on, is let the players experience their characters, because that's what they can't do in movies. You can watch the movies and you can see their stories, but video games let you get behind the wheel and feel like you're the character. And trying to do it all at once with Avengers was a mistake. So yeah, what I loved about all the Spider-Man games, even before Insomniac, but what Insomniac also, proved that you could do it in modern game design, was I felt like Spider-Man. I felt like I was actually Spider-Man swinging through New York, and it was a great escapist fantasy. And I'm so looking forward to that happening again with Wolverine. So, Marvel, dial it back. Bring me a Thor game that makes me feel like Thor. Bring me an Iron Man game that's like has the same feel of movement and flight as Anthem, except make it a good, solid single-player game that is awesome. Like, there's so many directions they could go, and it just feels like they're not. It feels like they're just trying to chase trends, and I don't like that. I want them to instead chase experiences. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that's why I want to see more Marvel from the future. So, anyways, we want to hear your thoughts, listeners. We want to hear what you think about Marvel games, Marvel in general. Just what are your Marvel thoughts? We want to hear those. Termite already shared where you can interact with us, and I will recap it real quick. 80bitpodsmash.com. You can find links to anything there. If you want to find more episodes of our podcast, you'll find links to various platforms where you can, of your preference, right? Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, Apple Podcasts, or you can just stream them right from that website. In addition, you can find links to all of our social medias. So Facebook, Reddit, Instagram, Twitter. We're on all those places. We're listening. We are eager to engage with you. And if you want to get us, like, our attention right away and talk to us live, they're in our show notes on those episodes. So just go to our website on, pull up the description of the first episode. There'll be a Discord link in there, so you can actually go to Discord and say, "Hey Penguin, what's up today?" or "Hey Termite, what's going on?" and share your thoughts there. And we'd love to hear what your feedback on Marvel games and this episode is about. So please check all that out. Termite, what's next week? What's coming up next week?
Next week, we are going to be talking about...
Sorry, I put you on the spot.
Right, console exclusivity.
That's right. This actually was your topic that you wanted to talk about. So we're talking about whether or not we think console exclusivity is good for video gaming in general. It is a complicated question with complicated answers. So hopefully it should fill up a nice hour-long podcast or more. So we will talk to you about that then, and see you then.
See you next week.